Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome. I'm Jonathan Schiffers. I'm Associate Director for Public Services and Communities here at the RSA. It's a pleasure to welcome you. Before we start, a couple of quick housekeeping things. We are filming tonight's event and live streaming on YouTube. So that means it's particularly embarrassing when phones go off. But you don't have to turn off your phones. We don't want to hear them, but we do want you to engage with a wider debate on Twitter, which is using the hashtag RSA Professions, and we'll take questions from our online audience later as well. So this lecture is part of the Bossum series. We're very pleased to have Bruce and Penelope Bossum with us tonight, who make this series of lectures on architecture and society possible. And tonight we're in great company. You're in for a real treat with Paul Morel. I saw Paul speak 3 or 4 months ago, and thought this was something that a wider RSA audience needed to hear. Paul is a chartered quantity surveyor. He worked his whole career at Davis Langdon, now part of AECOM. He was then, in recent years, the government's first chief construction advisor, working on low carbon, and in particular BIM, Building Information Management, which is increasingly important to a lot of lives of professionals in the built environment. I know a lot of people working on that right now. And then most recently, Paul worked on the EDGE Commission for collaboration in the built environment. And collaboration is a key theme for us at the RSA. We're also particularly interested in institutions and institutional change. You know, what is it about institutions that could unlock new ways of working, more productive ways of working, and solving some of society's major challenges? And I'm particularly concerned that the built environment plays its role in that. So in his lecture, Paul will, I think, quite powerfully argue for reform in the built environment sector among the professions, so that buildings and places and towns and cities can live up to the expectations that we have on them, right? We're hoping that new buildings, new cities in the future will solve sustainability, well-being, inclusion issues. Are the professions fit for purpose? That's what we'll hear about tonight. It's great that we're doing this at the RSA, because our work on cities and the built environment continues apace. We will be soon launching another city growth commission focusing on inclusion, working with core cities. Our other work includes working on developing socially productive places, working with developers and local authorities, and the role that they play alongside the professions and institutions that we'll hear about tonight. So Paul's going to speak for no more than half an hour, and then we'll take questions for the remaining time tonight. So please welcome Paul Morel.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to the RSA for this opportunity of sharing some thoughts with you. And I only have one speech. If the time changes, the speed changes, so if it's a bit fast, apologies. This is really about virtues, plural, but I couldn't quite get it on the line. But it's a particular pleasure to be giving a talk with this title, because about 25 years ago, Stuart Lipton, then a client, now and still a friend, pushed this book into my hands and said, read this. And if you know Stuart, you'll know that you do as you're told. So I did. And I still have a copy, not his. I got one which was, as a mark of a different age, has Finchley Public Library pressed into the spine in gold letters. And I'm hoping it was decommissioned, because in the front it says the damages are 3 old pence a week. And it was last signed out in August 1971, which by chance is just the month before I started work. But it was an influential book, and I think the two things I'd say about Alfred Bossum is he seemed to be relentlessly forward-looking, which I try to be. And something else he did, which I know I do, is keep banging on about the things that you believe in. And in many ways what the book says, I think, as you'll see, because like Jack Horner, I'm going to put in a thumb and pull out the odd plum as I go through, but digitally. In many ways everything's changed and nothing's changed. And it's also good to have chances like this. My favourite management consultant, A.A. Milne, and it's good to have a chance to get away from that usual problem of the urgent always driving out the important, and have a chance to think about some of the bigger stuff away from the day job. So that's a good moment for that too. And my second text for today is already been referred to by Jonathan, which is a piece of work done with the EDGE, generously funded by the Arup Foundation, just looking about where we're going, where the professions are going. And I guess my theme is we seem to be at a moment, but I'll come back to that. And in the course of that series of evidence-taking sessions and then assimilating that into the report that we published, there was constantly a sort of, it's all about what you know in the professions versus it's all about whether you're believed and trusted. And not many things in life are binary, and this isn't one of them, so I'd like to show really how the two things come together. And another politician with a happy gift for a felicitous phrase kind of says something that starts to bring those two things together, I think. You know, you need to be both. And in some ways, we're losing a bit of each, is what my theme is. Maybe we can start with something that we should agree with if we're reading the press, you know, that we have a problem. More particularly, I think we have just three that I'd like to start as context for this. And the first one is this. You know, I don't think a nation should be proud of itself if it can't house its people. And we have a massive and it seems intractable problem on that front. And the first of my plums from Alfred Bossam's book is, this is 1934, you know, not much has changed on that front. Still, you know, one of society's biggest challenges. Our buildings are, some of them crumbling and many of them are unsuitable. I was talking last year to the NHSS Scotland, and their 1 billion capital programme over the next period, 800 million of that is fixing defects in building. So that's our second problem. And as we know, I guess, all of our schools, every one of them, needs to be refurbished or rebuilt. 28,000 of them, and what a huge challenge that is. And our infrastructure is desperately needing upgrading. We're living off the heritage of the Victorians in that respect, and we need to replace what we've got and start thinking ahead as well. So we have a huge problem in terms of the extent to which the built environment contributes to the quality of our lives and growth. We have to try and fix that at a time when we haven't actually got a lot of money. The extent to which we don't have money is well illustrated by this graph that was produced in the spell that I did inside government in my second year. Post-election, the Office for Budget Responsibility produced figures that showed the debt position and how long it would take back to the level of borrowing formerly known as prudent. And the answer was that would be about 2031. So a generation of excessive debt. And if you wonder how we're doing so far, that's how far we've got into eating into that. Probably we have even less money now than we had in 2010. So the only thing that's slowing down is the speed at which we're going bust. And we are an expensive industry to buy off, becoming less and less affordable. So we're not in a good place as far as our economic situation is concerned, either nationally or in our industry. And the other great external driver is the extraordinary pressure on the world that population is creating. You know, if you look at the speed at which China is urbanising, and I chose Maidstone because it's Alfred Bossam's constituency, you know, a new Maidstone every 5 days, urbanising. You know, a quite terrifying pressure, therefore, on the built environment, and on the other hand, maybe an opportunity if we make our living this way. And the final piece of context, I guess, is the environment, and that kitchen worktop that we have at home, that we insist upon, polished granite, and we are excavating to the centre of the earth to find the stuff, as if it will never run out. I'm 68 next week. And no time when I was growing up did anybody say to me that stuff might run out. But that's the reality of this huge consumption from this huge number of people. And then, and I see Robin Nicholson sitting out there, you know, what he calls another form of waste, which is the prodigal way we live in energy terms and all of that being emitted to atmosphere. These are massive problems, and they all relate to how we live in this built environment. So a good expression, I think, from Ernest Rutherford, not that there's no money left, but we have to think our way out of this. And that sort of brings me to problem 2, which is this industry, you know, is increasingly unfit for the job it has to do, I think. And we need to start addressing that. It's worth saying, because I don't want to be constantly negative, that we do know how to do this stuff, whether it's underground or overground or well above ground. You know, we can do good stuff, although rather surprisingly, another quote from Alfred Bossam, notwithstanding his enthusiasm for skyscrapers in America, he didn't think they were the right thing here, and I sort of loved this quote from his book. But we have to admit that stuff does go wrong too often in the way that we make our living. And looking at all the old traditional characteristics of time and cost and quality and so on, 40% only of our jobs are delivered on time, and that might be a generous way of looking at it. In cost terms, I address you as the senior partner of the firm that was the quantity surveyor on the Scottish Parliament building, where this, as far as I know, the only spreadsheet ever to appear on national television, something I produced for the inquiry, which shows the original budget and the final account. And the arithmetic, at least, is simple, you might say. But what's truly shocking about this, really, is that number there is claims for loss and expense, as we call them in this industry. That is waste. People waiting to do stuff or undoing stuff that are already done. So more than the original budget went on waste and redoing and so on and so forth. So a huge issue, and it led to one of my favourite sayings, that too often projects get going off the back of a lie, or a hope. Let's be charitable to ourselves, of a hope that we can do it for the budget and that when it doesn't, we will be forgiven. It's not a good business plan, however. And on the quality front, we've all got our favourite sort of quality slides. If anyone can tell me what the hell's happening in the top right-hand corner, see me eating drinks afterwards. But we've all got examples of stuff that just doesn't get made right. So time, cost and quality, all suspect. And we don't look at where buildings really work, which is below the waterline in their whole life. We're just constantly making decisions on initial capital cost. And it's something that I will come back to, which is the gap. That as the final indignity, buildings don't do what we say they will do. They don't perform as they should. And in other industries, that's a scandal, and I'm going to go back to that. So we're not good, really, at the way we treat our customers. And I often say that in my first 25 years in business, and I think it's true, customer service was not a consideration. It was really a case of, this is what we do you want it or not? As opposed to really what customers need. And actually, I would quote Stuart Litvin's name again as really the first client I had where I thought, he didn't tell me what to do, but I thought, what we do is not what this person needs. So let's think again about what the customer needs. And we're not getting better. There's a forward look published in Construction Inquirer recently, which gave us the idea of what the future of our world might look like, half man, half machine. But you and I know the problem is not in the machine, the problem's in the man. We have some huge cultural problems and so on. And we too often don't engage with each other, or we argue with each other. We are a confrontational industry. And when I, in government, introduced the idea of using more frameworks and working with less people, a trade contractor said to me, the problem is that working in this environment, my staff are losing the ability to fight. And of course, if you have to fight to make a living, that's a skill you need to retain. But how much better a world it would be if that wasn't a skill that we needed. And we didn't spend so much time organising the deck chairs on the Titanic. And that is, by the way, a deck chair from the Titanic, taken off needlessly before it sailed. And Ted Hoppold, who founded the Construction Industry Council, I had a quote twice, and this is the first one. We just don't seem to know how to work together well enough for all kinds of ways. And here's my second plum from Alfred Bossom's book, that we have social reasons, and cultural reasons why we seem not able to consciously cooperate with each other. This is the biggest single thing, he said, then, and he was working in America nearly 100 years ago, that we didn't get right. Problem 3, nobody's perfect. We have issues with individuals and with institutions, which is undermining people's faith and belief, both in the professionals, in business. Too many examples of corporate dishonesty, notwithstanding their CSR policies, and some of that coming into our own world of lying and cheating and so on. And we start to address the idea of virtue in its broadest sense. There is no longer a guarantee that we know what a dishonest person looks like. And doing a bit of just sort of playful Googling the other day, all of these people are all what we would call professionals. From the church on the right, accountants, lawyers, school teachers, and they've all been found guilty of fraud. So the fraud doesn't actually declare themselves in an obvious way. So how do you know when somebody professes something to you? How do you know that you can believe it and have faith in it? And this institutional doubt has crept into our lives, the mistrust of institutions and the fact that they seem to be on the down. It seems to be across the whole of our world, and it's a problem, because I believe in institutions for reasons I'll come on to. So that is the context in which the Collaboration for Change exercise took place. And the reaction to it was varied. Some people were calm, and that might be my own view. So I did an article for Management Today recently, and they took a slightly more iconoclastic approach to it, sort of like bringing down the statues, and I agreed to the graphic on condition that the professions look archaic, hence the bowler hat, and the judge dressed in old style. And probably Building Magazine's idea that actually something is dying out, fading away, that is valuable if we don't act or react to our situation. Now, people are interested in it. It was the top-ranked article in Building that week. And they had a subscriber vote, which showed that actually more than half the people think the institutions of the professions are becoming irrelevant. That's a problem, I would say, because I think we need them. And I think there are good things about the institutions that we need to protect. We need someone as the guardian of the entry level of education. We need somebody to make sure that there's a level of competence going on. When people say, I can do this, can they do it? You know, how would you believe in the world that I've described of not being able to recognise a good and honest and skilled person? How do you know that what you're being told is true? We need somebody to accumulate a body of knowledge that we can digest and give back to our membership and lend to society in a way that I was shown. And we need someone to maintain standards of honesty and so on. And for all of those things, you need an institution. There's no reason why you should believe me when I say I've got those first four things. And I'm going to work now towards the value of virtue, as I put it. Because there are also bad things that are going on here as time moves on. On the educational world, I'm doing another piece of work for government on introducing a genuine desire to design for the disabled into our building education programme, and God, it's difficult. And what became clear talking to the institutions is some of them have very little control over the content of what they are authorising or accrediting and so on. And most educational courses in the built environment still reinforce the silos between us, between the various professions, and therefore increase the opportunities for conflict. And that's a problem, and the institutions are seen as obstructing change in that world. As far as quality is concerned, the institutions are hugely nervous, reluctant about the idea of being the judges of their own membership, when one of their battles is to retain and grow their membership. And one of the sort of deliberately cheeky recommendations, or thoughts at least, of Collaboration for Change is that maybe they should run a kind of TripAdvisor service for the quality of the membership. And this, of course, is a thought that horrifies most professional people. But if you ran a hotel, that's the world you'd live in, for all good and ill. It would need some pretty good mediating, but in some way, how do the public and our potential clients know whether our promises about ourselves can be honoured? And of course, knowledge changes. Hippocrates is quoted in the report as his oath, which in many ways is a better example than you might know, because of course he didn't write that oath. Nobody knows much about Hippocrates. It was written by generations of Greek doctors after him, or Greek specialists, and given to him on the grounds that then people trusted individuals more than institutions. And so we got the oath. But that wouldn't be a bad idea, an oath of some sort. But he had some extraordinary ideas, which of course we now know are mad. He in that perennial problem of understanding, for half the population not understanding how women behave the way they do, he thought that the womb moved around the body. And I'm sure he believed it. We now know that's not totally true. He got some things right, mind you, for some of us. But for the most part, if you think of what Greek medicine was like by comparison to what we do now, nothing dishonourable about what he didn't know. So knowledge is important in building it. And there are modern examples of that. I love the idea of an immediate relief from asthma if you smoke the right kind of cigarette. And your Christmas decorations made of asbestos, sprinkle some asbestos around the home. We learn more and know more. But somebody has to drive that continuous improvement in our knowledge base and so on. And to most professions, the challenge really is when they say we have a knowledge base is, well, show me. Where is it? If I were one of your members, where would I find the stuff I need in the latest information and so on? Some are good, but most aren't. So we need some kind of huge benefactor or something to have something like the King's Fund that drives a research programme. And in terms of our ethics and our behaviour and so on, if you read through all the various codes, all the right words are there. But we know that all these words can get compromised and undermined by sophisticated people and so on. You may remember the Spycatcher episode of Robert Armstrong, who clearly read Edmund Burke, who said something very similar. And it sounds no better in French. But the qualities that we think might be absolute become undermined and qualified and lead to what the governor of the Bank of England, talking to the Chartered Institute of Bankers, no less, said. There's the idea of ethical drift. That you finish up in a place that you would never have set as a destination in ethical terms, but step by step we find ourselves in a place we didn't really want to be. And that calls for vigilance. And the shortest sentence, I think, in the Collaboration for Change report, and written when it was almost prescient, was that even FIFA has a code of ethics. The existence of the code means nothing. It's what an institution does to enforce it and to demonstrate to the outside world that it means something. Nonetheless, something really rather distasteful about professions who say because they're professions, they are better people. I'm not sure that Facebook's invented a symbol for that yet, but I think it'd be something like that. That actually, I'm better than you is not a good selling proposition in the 21st century. And even more complexity around the idea of what the public interest is. I like this Matthew Parris quote, there's no such thing. And when the hell did somebody said in one of our sessions, when did anybody last ask the public what they wanted? But this is the single thing that the institutions themselves keep coming back to. We serve the public interest. And I'm not sure that we do. And the question that we never got an answer to really is, so what do you do when your principles point one way and the client's needs point the other? Nobody really gave a good answer to this question at any time. And I don't think anybody has ever been thrown out of an institution for not serving the public interest. So maybe what we do is do our best. And if that's the expectation of us, then that's what we should publicise as our expectation of each other, that we'll do our best. And then start to describe what that might mean and so on. And the rules are hugely variable. The RIBA has 3, and the CIOB has 60-odd, and I'm not sure it's because one lot is more given to ethics than the other. So and there's also confusion about what, as an individual, you're expected to regard as your code of conduct, what your business is meant to regard as, and what the institution is meant to take care of. One institution said to us, really, the duty to serve the public interest only exists at institutional level, but their own rules pass that rule down to their members. So there's a kind of confusion around that I think the duty of professions is to sort out, or the institutions is to sort out. Now, the institutions themselves have a kind of problem. They are slow to change, which is your fault and my fault. We only say 2 things about our institutions, that they never do anything, or if they do, that they're doing the wrong thing. And they have very small engagement from their membership. So then they're slow to change, and change does not go well with them. But there are some big changes. Since the institutions were set up, since this book was written, some huge changes in the world in which we live. For the most part, in the Victorian days, most people worked in private practice with a single interest. Now they work in LLPs, they work in PLCs, they work for government and the public sector and so on. So the membership's all over the place by comparison to where it was. Some of the businesses are on an extraordinary scale. ACOM, which as you've heard, took over the business that I was senior partner of, talking about the multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure business. I don't know how many of you are worried about a multi-trillion-dollar market, but it demonstrates the difference of the world that our Victorian forefathers had. And this I quoted in the C4C report, because you're allowed to buy or sell a business if you own it, but the idea of a profession selling itself, irrespective of the impact on its clients, on its staff, on its profession, when I started work, was inconceivable. They have every right to do so, and indeed they have now done so. But it was bought by a contractor, which is kind of confusing, and in parallel with that, a consultancy has bought a contractor. So it's becoming increasingly concerned. There's a shift in the balance of power, which we have to recognise, between consultants and contractors. And my father was, when he qualified as a surveyor, was forced to go to the RICS, not just acknowledge that he was no longer able to call himself a chartered surveyor, but actually give back his diploma because he'd become a contractor. A bad person, clearly. That world's kind of gone. But the lines between who we are and who we think we are and who we think other people are becoming increasingly blurred. And we don't have rules of engagement for that. And that's kind of reinforced when you see doctors and train drivers demonstrating and making the same claim, but their real interest is public safety. So it's a more confusing world. And that's just some of the internal stuff. Externally, I'm going to be very speedy about this, but whether or not you believe that robots will take our jobs, you have to believe about the extraordinary disruptive effect of technology. And the idea of people coming to see consultants and thinking they already know the answer. Doctor friends tell me that the patients come and say, I think I've got one of these 3 things, you just need to tell me what it is. And the sort of Google world, and that's coming to construction too. So finally, some thoughts about how we might address this. The things that we should. The idea is to get to grips with some big issues, not just to talk about ourselves, but to do that around some things which are in the public interest, to live up to our claim for ourselves. And the first is climate change, which is a subject for another talk, but massive market failure. Where markets fail, the professions should be in there trying to find some fixes. And not, by the way, blaming government. It's only government you must fix this. What does this industry think it can do about the impact of buildings on the environment and the impact of the environment on buildings? And again, nothing new here. Speaking in the House in 1942 in the war, when coal was a real issue, we would have done well, aren't we surprised somewhat these days to see we should have followed the American example. We're now preaching the other way around. Second issue is the fact that our buildings don't work. and studies on energy performance, even amongst so-called high-grade green buildings. The facts established that they were running at twice the energy consumption predicted, and across a broader study of buildings generally 5 times what the client was told the energy consumption would be. And in any other industry that would be and is a scandal. It's a sort of kind of form of misselling that we need to start thinking about us fixing it, not waiting for some external agency to do so. So back to, as Volkswagen know, that the risk implicit in this ought to be profound. And certainly the embarrassment should at least be profound. And yet, over and over again, we repeat the message, that our building will do this thing for you, and over and over again it doesn't. So we are denied the soft landing that we talk about so much. But that has to be our whole purpose, I would say. And how do we do that as an industry? If we could fix it by talking about it, we would have fixed it. But what are the practical steps? And what are the declarations we need to make to start addressing this? That's a big issue to me. None of that will be done with the industry as it currently is structured. So quickly, 3 things wrong with the industry. It's upside down, by which I mean that we work in this hierarchical way, which I often call the guano problem. It's how we dish out work in the British construction industry. We give it to a god architect or engineer who dribbles it down to co-consultants and so on. Down on the guano, people actually do stuff. People who make materials and fix things to walls, floors and ceilings. That's where the money is. And it comes from our class system. The idea of a hierarchy comes from that, but it separates us from the cash, which exists with people who actually do the work. You give £1 to a contractor, he keeps about 5 or 10 pence. The rest goes down to these guys. So conversations that lock us out from the manufacture of materials and the doing of the work lock out innovation. And this hierarchical, professional us and them structure does that. Barrier to innovation. And we're back to front, by which I mean that all the value in a job lies in the end in its use. And we have these serious fractures in our value chain between those who design buildings and those who manage their construction, between those who manage their construction and actually do the work, and all of the above and the end use. So value isn't pulling things in the way that it should. And finally, nobody owns the whole process, which explains really all of our problems. No one's accountable for it in the way that a car manufacturer is. At least we know whose problem the Volkswagen issue is. In our industry, we don't know that. So the answer is integration. And creating the only unit of success that we know we have, which is a team, and a good team. But again, the problem of who should be in that team comes in. And one of my least favourite sayings, really, often I have to say from people standing for office in the RIBA, is we must reclaim the high ground. I don't think there's any such place, and again, interesting to see what Alfred Blossom had to say about that in 1934, the idea of tablets of stone coming down to earth. And an idea that came from Matthew Taylor of this parish, which is the more professions think not about how they lock people out, that they're exclusive, but that they're inclusive. That they're starting thinking about the problems of society. That's where our answer lies. And recognizing that we have to stop thinking about ourselves as a series of people different from those who do the work, and even worse, different from each other in what our interests are. So again, I just keep seeing echoes all the time of what we say now and what we said in 1934. That we have this social barrier, and still, an inheritance of the Victorian creation of the professional class in many ways, separating us from that unit of success, a team that collaborates with each other. So the professions are becoming kind of curious, sort of archaic priesthood, and the idea that their job is to admit us to the Holy of Holies, to my mind, is just kind of gone as a useful way of thinking about them. And yet I can't help feeling that something would be lost if Bridget Prentice, when she was at the Constitutional Affairs, had got her way. It feels to me that there is something rather different from what we do and from a tin of beans. We should admit the fact that we work for a living. The question is, how do you recognise an opportunity to make cash and yet maintain objectivity in your advice? But we shouldn't pretend that we're in social work unless indeed you are. We make stuff. We make stuff for a living. But nonetheless, I think there is, and hence the purpose of my talk, the title of my talk, a kind of market-based approach to why it pays to be virtuous in the broadest sense, which is, that most clients are concerned about value for money, and they attach a value to integrity. And therefore, what that means, and the guarantee that they'll get it, has a value. And so there's consequently a value in employing me because I say I'm a chartered something. There's a value to me being an institution that will verify that, and there's a value to me saying I don't want those people in the same institution as me if that's the way they're going to behave. We demand of our institutions that they get tough, rather than all the time look for ways that they're not allowed to get tough with us. I think that would start with the beginnings of bringing together the ideas of trust and knowledge and avoiding the battle between them. And also gives us an authority with government. Because it's, having spent 3 years there, I can tell you, it's pretty hard to get a word in edgeway. Yeah, and for the most part, this industry comes to government and says, I've got these problems, can you sort them out for me? In the meantime, they've got the big problems I've been talking about. And I never in 3 years heard somebody say, you've got a big problem, here's how we can contribute to the solution of it. That would be a good thing for a profession, and a series of professions, and an industry to do, against the background that I've said of environmental harm and no cash, and so on. So, Aristotle. We look at things that are useful to others in the way we give our advice. We look at the quality of the way we behave and the quality of what we know, and we get that verified by an institution, and we don't just give them permission to do that, we demand of it that they do that, rather than disengage and allow. And moving seamlessly back in time from Aristotle to Plato, I don't quite know why I finished out the so many 4th century Greeks in this talk, but it just kind of happened. I thought I'd have the temerity to improve on Plato. These good values of the heart and the hand and the mind and so on, and what we should be selling out there. Learning, that we're educated, that we have knowledge, we have skill. Judgment, that we can, this is where we beat the computer. That we can take that information and turn it into advice about how we solve some of these big social problems we have, as well as our individual clients. Propriety, you can take it for granted that we will act in a certain way. I've chosen objectivity as the word, but why our advice should be taken seriously. Because notwithstanding that ka-ching moment, the advice itself is based in the best interest of the person we're talking to. And all that comes down to leadership. An industry that leads itself. And so where are the leaders that will lead this forward? I think, as I said at the beginning, that we're at a moment. I don't know that we should be alarmed, not least because there's not much point, but we should be awake. And I think the moment is both a threat. We could wake up one day and find that everything that we value has gone. You must see how different it is in professional terms from the world of Alfred Bossum, but also how similar it is in terms of the challenges that we face. And if we get that right, then I think we have something to be proud of as individuals, as institutions, as professions, and as an industry. And that's the world that I joined to try and do some good, as most of you did. So now is the moment, I think, and I'm going to leave the last word, like so many others, to Alfred Bossum, because he said it in 1934. It's been true every year since. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'll let everyone take a breath and think of their questions. If you're keeping score, that was a new RSA record. We had over 170 slides. And I encourage you, this talk will be in the archive like all others, so you can go back and relive it. I really enjoyed that. I'll save my questions. Who has a question in the audience? We have roving mics, so if you could just tell us your name and if you want to add any flourish or detail to that, go for it. So we've got 2 questions. Let's take them together. In the middle first, and then on the side, that's you. Okay, thank you.
Richard Blythe, Royal Town Planning Institute. The government is suggesting that applicants for planning commission can choose who they have to write their reports to local authority planning committees by. The applicant can choose the writer of the report. Do you think that's a good idea?
Okay, we'll hold that and then take one more and then we'll come back.
Oh, is it me? Sorry.
Yes.
Robert Adam. I have 2 questions and I'll try and be brief. One is, Paul, I don't think anyone would actually, I find it very hard to disagree with you, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I don't think anyone would say that they're lacking in integrity or trust. I certainly wouldn't. Other people might disagree. And equally, no one would disagree that there should be high educational standards and good standards generally in the professions. But effectively that leads to groups, professions, it doesn't matter if they're groups, professions or single professionals, which are by definition closed elites. That's an inevitable consequence. And that makes them experts. And one of the things about experts is, of course, they know they're right. And so the issue, my first question, which I'll leave as a question, there's always a dilemma between experts serving the public with what the public think is in their interest, and or what the professionals think the public should have for their interest. So that's my first question as a question. Secondly, more of an observation, which I think you'll probably agree, because we talked some time ago about the problem of measurement and sustainability and the issue of longevity. And I don't know if you ever did come up with what you were going to come up with was an acceptable measure of longevity, because a 200-year-old building is inherently sustainable. But there is no process for measuring that that I know of. And one of the problems we have is measurement. For example, in housing, you buy land by the square foot, you construct by the square foot, and you sell by the square foot, and you then sell with comparables. For those who are in the industry, they'll understand that. The problem with that measurement process is that quality is an intangible and is never built into that process.
Okay.
Second, I'll just finish briefly.
That's already two questions.
And it isn't. I haven't finished the second question yet.
Okay,
the other one is investment cycles. I'll be very brief. Is investment cycles, 10-year investment cycles, and building materials. They tend to lead to short-termism. And the issue is of measurement.
Okay. Any order you like, Paul?
You're a barrister. The judge would have made you sit down a long time ago. Let's start with the RTPI, I think, goes to the very core of the issue, doesn't it, really? Because what you're asking is, would I trust somebody, given that job, to think about what the public interest is? You can understand why it happens. It's a government reaction to the fact that we all complain about the quality of planning advice inside local authorities. So therefore, you tend to look outside. But the challenge, do I think it's a good idea? It's probably not a worse idea than what happens now. It would be a thoroughly good idea if it led to, I can't quite avoid saying a great national debate, which is what politicians say when they don't quite know what should happen. But if it led to a real debate about what we actually want to be the things that drive the decisions to give yes or no. I have to say that I talked about the work I've been doing for DWP on disabled access. And I know from my day job that disabled access consultants often get selected because they're not troublemakers. In other words, they will give the developer not too much of a bad time. And we live with the consequences of that. So there's plenty of evidence for fearing that people who are paid by the people will dance to the piper's tune, a long way around. So it would be a good idea if the institution itself could demonstrate to the public why it is that it should be trusted to be given that job. And it's not fashionable these days to say to government or others, that privatising, outsourcing things isn't the answer. But it's a thing that comes back to us. It shouldn't be a problem for the government or local government. It should be a problem for planners and for the rest of us. So it gets you back to, if the RTPI thinks that's a good or a bad thing, what does it think? How could it be a good thing? And you challenge yourselves to that. Robert, measurements. I suppose that comes back to my whole point about the sustainability point that we made in this report was a personal theory that doesn't altogether go down well, but it's something I said when I was inside government. You have to ask yourself, I said there are not many binary questions in life, there is one binary question. Do you think that what's happening in the environment contains the potential for catastrophe? And I remember saying to Michael Fallon, who's not the softest person in government, if you don't believe in the potential for catastrophe, you're wasting billions. If you do, you're not doing nearly enough. And the industry needs to ask itself that too, and institutions need to ask that, because much though we talk about sustainability, I can't find the things that you've talked about, a clear plan from our side of the fence. And why do we think government could develop one that didn't have the skills, the time or the knowledge? Where is the industry's plan for starting to address that problem, of which the things you talk about would be part of the kit? So no, we don't have good measures of longevity. We don't have strategies about longevity. We don't even have a kit of parts by which you might decide whether longevity is client by client something you should be going for. And I understand why you raise it as an issue. And in the context of the word I described, the material is running out, we should have more attention to it. But who do we think should make us pay attention to that? And so all these questions kind of come back to my main theme, really, which is the answer is us. But we're prevented from doing so by the way that we don't collaborate with each other, that things are, if you look at the performance gap and think about who has to get aligned around that idea, and then you try and align them, you realise just how much of a problem we face between ourselves to fix some of these things. And if we can't, I'll say again, why would anybody on the outside be able to do so? So that's a kind of omnibus answer to your omnibus question. No, we don't have the tools, but we could have, and I'm sure that somewhere, someone's done some work that could be turned into one. But like so many good pieces of good work, it gets lost in the absence of us working together to develop a kit of parts by which we will solve some of these problems.
Paul, who does this well? Because we've talked, I guess, implicitly about UK institutions. Are there other countries or parts of the world where you'd say, well, at least they've got more collaboration, or their ethical standards are lived true in their values, etc.?
I'm not sure about the latter bit. I mean, in terms of how people work more collaboratively, it's sometimes with a pretty big stick. In other words, their motivation may not be altruism or a genuine desire to get on with each other, but most of the world works in a clearer way, in terms of how you get this thing forward. But of course, you need to be careful where that force comes from. So, I used to say, working with some of the big French contractors, it doesn't matter what you draw, they'll put a 6-inch concrete slab in because they know it works. But you really wouldn't want the whole process of creating a building whose value lies in its use to be driven by somebody who's worried about the thickness of the concrete slab. So where it's clearer, it's not necessarily better. In terms of sustainability, the frustration about that really is, I don't think anybody does it better. And in sitting in BIS, as I did for 3 years, I had some meetings, extraordinary meetings with ministers and higher from Vietnam, from Hungary, from Colombia. Chap handed over a box with powder in it, turned out to be coffee, rather disappointingly. People all over the world come to us to ask what they should do. And I tried to set as a hopelessly over-ambitious objective. Why wouldn't we try and become the first country in the world that knows how to decarbonise an entire economy? Now, what would that give us as an opportunity in the world? And when there was a move against even the idea of zero carbon homes, the only way we kept it in play for a while was to say to the Chancellor and others, before you say you think that's a wrong way to go, which he did, go down to EcoBuild, which was on at the time, and look at the investment you'll be trashing of businesses who've decided that this is a problem that has to be solved, and eventually that binary decision that the world has to make, everybody will have to make it. If you don't, then don't go there. But unless you believe in it, you won't start developing businesses and products and services around it. If you did, we have a spectacular opportunity, not out of altruism, but out of growth, ironically, of telling people to do this. So we have the potential.
Let's take another round of questions, and I'd also encourage, if anyone's watching online, submit your questions via the hashtag, and we can pick those up and ask them. I have one here, and then one in the front. I'll take those two for now, and I've seen them.
Thank you very much. My name is Sandy Rees-Jones, and it's great to hear you again, Paul. Hello. I'm in the gloom here. Lots of recurring themes, but when I first saw the title, I was reminded of preparing a paper some years ago that was to do with ethics and engineering. I've spent my career in the world of construction with a lot of work in international engineering, and a very interesting paper had been produced by an American who essentially said, why are you engineers always bleating on about being undervalued and unrecognised and low profile? Make the most of it, guys, because at least nobody hates you. Which takes us on to what is it we're looking for, and you use the word trust a lot, and I was reminded of one of the first of many reviews of performance in construction, which was Trust and Money, back in 1994. You were talking about trust. There's been a report just now about trust and people. And the whole issue of how do we get this cross-fertilization. I've been involved in a number of these reviews. The most recent was one called Never Waste a Good Crisis, which Andrew Wolstenholme chaired, and there were 8 of us. And we picked up this permeability issue, that we have the poor client out there who doesn't actually give a monkey's whether you all talk the same language. They want the reliability of a product. Why can we do something about it? Now, what I want to do is cut to two things. One is two small ways in which I try to make a difference, and then turn it back to ask you, how is there any glimmer of hope? On the working together, I was on the board of Engineering UK for 6 years, and one of the best things about it, apart from launching the Big Bang Engineering Science Fair, which got 75,000 young people through the door to find out about careers in that, was that over the course of 6 years, I saw all these different institutions, for the first time in my experience, begin to work to a common objective. And the outcome was coming together for a fair.
Can you get to your question very quickly, just so I have enough time for other questions
right.
too?
The second thing is I work with a group that ignores the institutions, and I work with an organisation that brings together people who are architects, engineers, surveyors, contractors, surveyors, lawyers, accountants, and what we try to do is do a better job within the umbrella of our world, not the umbrella of our institutions. You've been involved in many initiatives, Paul. Your view sounded rather gloomy. Is there any move forward? Is there any glimmer of hope that something is happening that will actually trigger that recreation of trust and the building of institutions as a force for good?
Thank you. And over here, you have your mic.
Thank you very much. Kerry Mashford, National Energy Foundation. Paul, we encountered each other a little while ago when I was running the Building Performance Evaluation Programme for the Technology Strategy Board, which is now Innovate UK, and the results of that are now coming into the public domain. In fact, even this weekend, a big hackathon on that. I moved to the National Energy Foundation in order to try and address the issues associated with the performance gap. And I just wanted to ask you if you're aware of any other situations where this kind of thing is happening. What we've put in place and are now piloting in a number of places is an assured performance process, which basically identifies the performance risks at planning, design, detail design, delivery and handover and execution and operation stages. And at each stage of that tries to remove the risk, mitigate it, or pass it forward as a highlighted risk for better attention at the next stage, to specify and require a particular standard. And we've been looking at trying to get identify where the market pressure is for that in order to get that delivered trust and impartiality into the delivered performance of a building. That's happening quite well. And
If you could get to your question again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wondered if the recent changes in the dropping of the zero carbon homes and such like, you think that's actually going to put a brake on activity?
Let me join them together. Am I optimistic? Well, I don't know any other way to live. So yes. Where do you see signs for hope? Rooms like this, people are talking, groups are meeting. We had some terrific young people. I mean, somebody stood up at one of our sessions when we were all being very gloomy and said, I'm 24 years old, shall I just go and kill myself now? And you just reminded us really that, that young people have a different frame of thinking. The challenge is how you don't let that happen in coffee houses only. For the reasons I give, and I hand, that's kind of the problem, that nobody owns it as an issue, and a lot of people kind of want to own something about it, but won't commit collectively to it. So one of the things the age is trying to motivate now is the two things that we need for this is a pledge and a plan. The pledge is, look, we want to do something about this. Because the slightly demoralising thing about what you said is, you're looking for, what government's doing, what the regulation is, and so on. We have the answers. We know why our buildings don't work. And we don't need government to tell us. And indeed, although I'm a believer in regulation because nothing else seems to make us move, this government isn't a believer in regulation. And there's no doubt that it's set back things. The extent to which the messages, they're not even mixed, have all gone in one direction under this government, is bad because it discourages investment. Which is my point, in 2010. Go and see Eco Build. People are making a business out of this because they think it's got to happen. And now people are discouraged, and then businesses are being destroyed as a consequence of that. So that is a worry. But it keeps coming back to the same thing. Who do we think should make us do the right thing? You know, we make these grand statements about we're professionals, and then we don't collaborate with each other. You know, we expect somebody else to fix the problem of the party. So what one's looking for all the time, and I would work, and I do work with the existing institutions, because anything you reinvent will quickly develop the same problems, the same weaknesses and so on. And we don't need a single, and one of the questions was, do we need an institution of the built environment? To which the answer is, well, none of us are young enough. You talk about engineers collaborating. The ICE and the MECI have been talking for 50 years about merging. Still arguing about buildings and bars and so on and so forth. So that doesn't seem to be the answer. So how do we make them work together? And Ted Happold created a Construction Industry Council, which is, again, a perfectly good body if we put our weight behind it. And if it's got a problem, let's fix it. But again, if we recreated it, it would very quickly have the same problems. So the problem is us. The problem is us, and one of the slides I took out of here was the extent to which I discovered when talking in government that when you talk about a different way of working, you could see people's minds thinking, not would this be good for society, clients, each other, but how will this affect my existing business model? The vested interest keeps coming in, how will this affect my business model? And I get that, which is why things need to be reasonably slow. But we really ought to be embarrassed about the fact that we seem to think that somebody else should solve this. We all know whose fault it is, it's somebody else.
On a related point, is there something about the leadership of the professions and perhaps the lack of diversity in that? So if the problem is us, is the problem that us is too homogenous? So like a lot of professions, there would be a age, class, gender bias to the way in which these professions are led. And we mentioned kind of, having young people involved and having a different perspective. What do you think about that? Is there a problem of groupthink, complacency, or a lack of perspectives and diverse dialogue?
I don't think it's as clever as groupthink, where we all persuade each other of the wrong thing. I think we know this is the wrong thing. And whilst diversity, as I used to say regularly in government, it's a miracle the human race survived when half of them are missing in most rooms I sat in. I don't think that's actually the core of this problem. The class thing is, it's not so obvious now, but it's the fact that we've inherited an idea of a stratified society, and that we have a certain position in it. And there's a particular issue when, read Bosman, he talks to the people who plaster walls to work out how best to plaster it. And thought it was, it's extraordinarily forward-looking when you read it now. But, no thoughts about it at all. And you see what he thought about architects who go up Mount Sinai. We just need more of that thinking. And so the discouraging thing, in answer to Sandy's question, is that this is 100-year-old thinking.
Yeah. Let's take another round of questions, and I will prioritise them for anyone who is younger than me. I'm 31. I guess I have to judge from here whether you look under 30.
I think it's also in prioritise anybody called Bosman.
Yes, okay. So we'll take one from the corner, and then one here, and then over on the far side there. Now, I'm going to be really harsh and embarrassing if these questions go over 30 seconds. So, cut to the chase. What's your question, sir?
Hi, David Copeland, 25. Just to tie in a few things that you said. You mentioned briefly about eco-build and about the government sort of changing their decision on zero-carbon houses and stuff like that. Possibly, I presume, the watering down of code for sustainable homes and other initiatives, investment in offshore wind farms, etc., etc. I could go on. I think I agree with you. Institutions have an important part to play in creating change, and regulations and legislation can have a huge impact, and in their absence can have a huge impact. You also say it's with us that we need to change. We need to create the change. I suppose my question is, when the government is so clearly not taking the lead on this, and like you say, for some reason people look up to the UK from all over the world. We are in this position. Maybe it's a hangover from our imperial past. I don't know, but people look up to us. So we have this position where we can lead, where we can create this change. How can we do that? Do we need to set something up? There's I see Kickstarter as a brilliant example of outside of the government creating change. Could we create maybe something similar to that? Okay. It's kind of an open-ended question, but there you go.
Thank you. Alfred, I see.
Bruce Boston. Can technology replace some of the roles that create the tensions you've described?
And can I just check, have we got any questions that have come through via Twitter? Not at the moment. Okay. So let's collect one last question over there in the corner. Keep it very, very brief, because this will be the last round, and I'll leave Paul to have the final word. So Kickstarter, technology.
My name is Charles Kenyon, and I wondered how you draw on the experience from local authority planning committees, particularly with the neighbourhood plans and the local plans, which are government initiatives which have started fairly recently and which are democratic and very rigorous. And I would have thought there would be a great deal of information about what people want and how they want it from those particular bodies.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you.
I'm just going to agree with that. And
Yep.
that's probably the easy way of dealing with that. In terms of what we can do and what the government can do, very briefly why I thought the Code of Sustainable Homes was a brilliant thing. It's because once you had the code that said if we get these things right, we have something that works. And we started to trial ideas around that and so on. The market leaders then demonstrated what worked. And they demonstrated that having said that a code for a home would cost £50,000, the cost came down and down and down as they worked on it. And then when you see that you can do it, then you regulate. And I think that was a very good cycle of an industry demonstrating what can be done, and then a government saying, in that case, that's what we want. And I think, therefore, you need the industry, again, to make the pledge that we want to get to that place. Because why should we feel more angry with government that we make buildings that are totally unsustainable than we do with ourselves? It is annoying, and there are problems of a scale because it is, as Stern said, the biggest market failure in history that only governments can solve. But there's a lot we can do. And do we need to form something new? Well, it would be much better if those of us, who belong to institutions that already have the structures and so on, decided that these are the important things. And as I said, we collaborate around fixing them, which is why it's chosen as one of them. Technology, I think, is two things. I think it's an enabler and a pressure for change. And I think it will change a lot. It won't suddenly replace, sort of solve all the problems instantly and so on. But the reason that I latched onto building information modelling when I was in government was looking for something which would be both an enabler and a pressure for making people work together more. And you can only do that around a single model if you've got your processes and your thinking is straight and you work collaboratively. And so that's why I, to be honest, without ministerial cover at the time, stood up and said in 2010, by 2016, if you can't work in BIM, you won't be working for government, and then got permission afterwards. And I never thought it would be doable, to be honest. I never thought every government department would get itself in a position to be a client in that environment. And I'm still slightly surprised to learn that actually they will be there in 2016. There will be no government department that doesn't know how to be a client in BIM. I wouldn't have given a prayer for one or two of them. We had great pathfinders, and boy, they're learning a lot about the business of being a client. And they're learning that their processes are wrong. So what that aspect of technology provides is an opportunity to rethink how we work together and a tool by which we can work together and to look at our processes. And when the Ministry of Justice, which was the pathfinder for BIM in government, looked at its processes, there were literally things where it was saying, why did we do that? And nobody could remember, but it took 3 months. Or we need to make a decision here, but the information's not until here. So the technology thing, I think, is that it will certainly disintermediate people who have no ability to process knowledge and turn it into advice, which is not a bad thing, probably. But most of all, I hope it will drive a change in human behaviour that starts to address the problems we've been talking about this evening.
Good. Let's end on that note. I'm desperate to keep talking, and I've got more questions, but I'll hold them for being downstairs in the Benjamin Franklin room, where we kindly have time for a drink together. So I just want to say thank you again to Paul Morel, and we hope to see you downstairs and continue the conversation. Thank you again for coming. Thanks a lot, Paul.